Welcome back to Life with the Spectrum. I'm your host, Gina Cavalli, and at one of my speaking engagements, a mother came up to me and she said, Gina, have you ever heard of PDA? And I was like, public display of affection? She's like, no, hello, everybody thinks that immediately, but it's something real. It's called pathological demand avoidance, and it is very real in the world of autism. And so because I had never heard about it, I thought maybe you haven't heard about it. And so I wanted to bring somebody on that could talk about it. With me today, Dr. Brandi Smith, the psychologist at the Children's Autism Awareness Center. Hi, Dr. Brandi. How you doing?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks so much for being on the show. When this mother came to me and brought to my attention something called PDA, I, of course, said public display of affection. And she's like, nah. And she wasn't joking. And I was like, I didn't know that this was a thing in the world of autism. Can you please tell our listeners what PDA stands for?
Sure. So most commonly stands for pathological demand avoidance. It's also known as pervasive drive for autonomy.
Is that the same as like ODD, like oppositional defiance? It sounds so like they marry one another.
Yeah, many people think it is the same. It is not. The basis of it, where it stems from, is very different between the two diagnoses. And then just kind of how it presents itself is oftentimes very similar appearing. But what's really happening for a child with PDA, as a PDA, someone on the spectrum, as opposed to someone with ODD, whether or not they're on or off the spectrum, there's an anxiety component to it, as opposed to kind of that true primary behavioral component. And there's no vindictive nature, like for the sake of just kind of not respecting other people's boundaries or authority. These individuals actually really feel an anxiety response to other people not respecting their boundaries or autonomy, which is really hard for a child, since adults do tend to disrespect their boundaries pretty frequently, and it's the norm. These children, they feel traumatized by it, essentially. So it's quite different.
With the anxiety component, would you say then the symptoms are kind of similar to like an ADHD type thing?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay.
Symptoms can be, so instead of being like inattention can accompany it, and hyperactivity, just because these individuals are on the autism spectrum. But what we're really seeing is rigidity to a high level, and then meltdowns can often look like tantrums or irritable mood or verbal, sometimes physical threats towards others, or actual aggression towards others. And it's what it's in response to is what we're looking at.
Well, give us a couple of examples of what a child with PDA might experience, so parents have an idea of maybe signs to look for in their own child.
Sure. So kind of in the name, the biggest one is a demand. And a demand can look like anything to a child with PDA, but I think most families recognize or start to recognize that their child might be showing signs of PDA when their child is both very affectionate and very much loves their family, but then at times they really struggle with basic tasks around the house. They struggle with getting up and getting dressed in the morning. They'll struggle very significantly with going to school, coming home and getting schoolwork done, doing nighttime routines. And it can go from like kind of that mild side of the spectrum to really significant PDA, which would be children who don't like to be told good morning because that feels like a demand to have a good morning. Or
like, how do you do that? Like, for the parent, then what do you say if your kid doesn't like to say good morning? Like, do you just shut up?
Sometimes nothing.
Oh no.
Most times nothing. You can smile. You can talk about yourself. There's lots of things. There's lots of strategies that can actually go into place. Um, it just depends on the child and what their specific demand avoidance needs are.
Now, let me ask you a question. Now that you've given some examples, how do you go in, Dr. Brandi, and diagnose a child? Like when the child comes in to sit with you for an evaluation, what are some of the questions that you ask that kind of bring it? I mean, they might be on the spectrum and you know that, but then how do you kind of really know that it is PDA as opposed to ODD or ADHD or any one of the other components that can be factors on that spectrum?
Sure. So first and foremost, my evaluations are not going to be centered on PDA in the sense that I'm diagnosing it, right? PDA is not a diagnosis. And so my evaluations from a diagnostic standpoint are to rule in or rule out autism, unless they're already coming in with an autism diagnosis. Then I would be ruling in or out any behavioral diagnoses that might be associated with autism. From there, if those are ruled out, I'm also looking at the PDA, in which I can see from a behavioral standpoint, and sometimes it can be very subtle signs because many of these kids in new situations with new people and in public, they mask very well. So it's very subtle signs. Sometimes I'll do an interview with them based on a checklist called the Emotional Demand Avoidance Checklist. I usually give that checklist to parents, but again, knowing that I've already talked and done a whole intake interview with parents and kind of went over many of these things, but this just gives us a scale. And then I'll also potentially, depending on the child's age, ask them questions and see what their responses are. And there's usually a quality to those responses. A child with ODD doesn't talk about how when they're an adult, they're not wanting to choose to live with their parents, but a child on the spectrum might say, I want to live with my mom, and have zero indication that there's as much trouble going on at home as maybe a child with ODD would. And so there's lots and lots of little things that you can pick up on. There's also tons of strategies that kids will use while we're doing an assessment. So my assessments with these children and sometimes teens can look very different from a standardized assessment with somebody without this presentation. Sometimes we're not doing any questions at all. And sometimes we're just kind of hanging out and we have to forego some type of standardized assessment. Oftentimes I'm presenting items to them, just like showing pictures. And I'm like, oh, I wonder if anybody in this room can figure out this question, because I'm not asking them to do it. And so things like that, when I see that one strategy works over another, that also helps me figure out whether or not it's PDA versus something like ODD or conduct disorder or ADHD.
Well, sitting with me today, Dr. Brandi Smith. She's a clinical psychologist at the Children's Autism Assessment Center. Dr. Brandi, when we get back, I want to talk to you a little bit about more of those strategies and treatments with PDA. Stay with me.
Life with the Spectrum would like to thank our friends at Don's Tree Service. Mention that you heard it here and get 10% off. 770-413-TREE. If you'd like to have your business name here, reach us at gcast.com.
Welcome back to Life with the Spectrum. I'm your host, Gina Cavalli. With me today, Dr. Brandi Smith, a psychologist over at the Children's Autism Awareness Center. Dr. Brandi, we were just kind of talking about strategies when you go to evaluate a child. What kind of treatments are there for a child with PDA? Like, does ABA work? Or would that do the reverse?
That one would probably be contraindicated.
Okay.
So ABA tends to set off all of the alarm triggers and kind of make it a little bit worse for them.
Oh.
Yeah. So, and which is counterintuitive to what we know about autism, right?
Right.
Yeah. And so these kids are very different compared to what we know traditionally speaking from our research regarding autism, at least here in the United States. There's plenty of research on this elsewhere, like in the UK and Australia. With PDA, interventions that tend to be most helpful are, number one, parent interventions. So I always recommend that my parents are seeking as much support and guidance as possible through parent training programs, because once they change their structure and their parenting structure, it makes a world of a difference.
Yeah.
Oftentimes they know what to do, but everybody in the society and doctors are telling them to follow traditional parenting methods, which don't work, and they know it, but they're trying every method. And so it's just nice for them to start trying these things that we know do work, with them not feeling like they're crazy or doing something wrong from a parenting standpoint. So that's the biggest one, is for parents to start educating themselves and changing their parenting styles and what they're expecting from the home. From there, so children would also, the child with PDA benefits pretty significantly from therapy if they are choosing it. So again, if they are choosing to go and they want to work on things, we are not taking away their autonomy. They can benefit pretty significantly from just working on anxiety reduction.
Right.
And then again, they're on the autism spectrum. And so we're also talking about building predictability in their environment, right? So sometimes it's social skills, sometimes it's emotional, intuition that they're working on in therapy, but all of those can help alleviate some of the anxiety that we know is stemming because of their autistic brain.
Yeah.
Some kids will benefit from therapy, even if they're not choosing, and that's more so to get them excited. But at that point, right, therapy is not focused on any certain goal except for rapport building. And therapy would really need to be with a specialized individual. So it needs to be with someone.
I was just going to ask, it seems like PDA is so rare. One, I haven't really ran into too many families other than one who brought this to my attention that it even existed. And then when you had mentioned earlier that really more research is done across the pond in Australia, I mean, how many people do we have here, let's just say in Georgia, that number one, diagnose it like you do? Are there other doctors like you, Brandi, here in Georgia, or are you the only one?
I'm not the only one. So more recently, historically I was the only one.
Right. This is so rare.
Yes. More recently, though, there has been an influx of therapists. However, still very, very few. I know there's a website, there's a couple of websites that are devoted to PDA here in the United States. I would imagine most families that get to my office know those websites already. But they actually have Excel sheets that list some of the providers in our state. So I know there's at least one in like the Atlanta area that specializes, and one that I've recently learned in Savannah. There's somebody else that I've come across that has listed that they're very familiar with PDA, but I haven't been able to actually get in touch with that person. But what I'm actually finding is that more and more psychologists are commenting on the PDA profile in their evaluations. However, maybe they don't have quite a specialty, but they're starting to become informed. And so they may not be listed on there because they don't feel so confident in working with these families, but they do feel at least comfortable identifying it. So it's becoming greater here in Georgia.
And when we say that it's rare, in your professional opinion, or, well, you probably know these stats, how many kids have you diagnosed here in Georgia with PDA?
Oh gosh, I think I don't have a number for you. I think that the identification of our PDA profile is not so rare if we know what we're looking for.
Really? Okay, so it's not as rare as we're just hearing about it and it's coming to fruition here in the United States.
Right, because it's not been heavily researched at this point, and it's not part of our DSM criteria, so we can't actually make any official diagnoses. And so for anybody who follows the medical model of psychology, right, it's not sticking. It's not so commonly talked about.
With me today, Dr. Brandi Smith, the psychologist over at the Children's Autism Awareness Center. When we get back, we're going to talk about other rarities when it comes to being on the spectrum. Stay with me.
I'm Lyra Gillenwaters. Thanks for checking out this episode of Life with the Spectrum. If you subscribe to the channel, you'll always see the newest episodes when they come out.
Welcome back to Life with the Spectrum. I'm your host, Gina Cavalli. With me today, Dr. Brandi Smith, psychologist over at the Children's Autism Awareness Center. Dr. Brandi, have you seen other rarities like PDA, but things that maybe parents need to know about so that they can be on the lookout when they first get that diagnosis, especially now that they're diagnosing as early as 1? Are there other things that parents like, oh, PDA, okay, now it's on my radar? What other things should people be looking for?
I think in terms of profiles, I think the only one that comes to my mind really is the female phenotype, which is just, again, another kind of presentation of autism, but it's less commonly diagnosed because females often present differently than our heavily researched, primarily male cohort groups, right? And right. Especially I still hear it today. Pediatricians will say it's too late or too early to get a diagnosis until they're around 2, 3, 4. And I think for females, that's also very much the case, especially since their presentation, if we're talking about a female with a female presentation or female phenotype, oftentimes their kind of outward signs or characteristics of autism are much more subtle, and you really have to know what you're looking for. And so that can be tricky to identify in kids really young, but that would be maybe the other kind of just form of autism it's not classical autism, right?
No, but we want flags. You know, if something's going on with your child and it's a girl, right? And you know, right. Oh, yeah, oh, wait, I heard something about that. Maybe I should just keep an eye on it. Then this helps parents because that early intervention component is a key. To get the therapy started as early as possible, I mean, it just... Again, I always use my son as the example. He would not be where he is today without that early intervention. I mean, he just made huge strides, and it happens when they're young like that, right?
Right. It does, especially if we're, just to go back to the PDA profile, right? If we can help these children out at 2 and 3 years old and start making their environment much more predictable, stop creating patterns that cause them so much anxiety, we help them out much greater than when we're bringing them in at 6, 10, 12, and we're having to undo that many years of perceived trauma.
Right? Perceived trauma. That's what it is to them, too, for sure.
It is, yeah.
Dr. Brandi, where can people find you?
Oh, everywhere. My website is caacAtlanta.com. You can Google my name, Google the Children's Autism Assessment Center, and then I'm also listed on many of the PDA websites as well as a practitioner.
And one last thing before I let you go. So say, for instance, you're a parent, you're just finding out that your child is on the spectrum. Can you give us 1 or 2 signs, starting at an early age, and I mean like just after they're talking or getting those first words in, right? What kinds of signs can parents look for children with the PDA profile?
I would say if it is persistent difficulty going through day-to-day demands. So if you can identify that bath time is a struggle because they're really struggling with the sensory aspect of water on their head, that's one thing. But if it's let's start bath time and I like bath time, but actually I don't want to do it, and it's a continuous struggle every day, and it persists throughout many different aspects of their life, getting up in the morning, eating breakfast, anything that you're basically asking them to do is causing meltdowns throughout the day, and you're not able to really identify whether or not, basically you've tried everything at this point. You've tried reinforcements, you've tried token economies, nothing is working, focusing on all the good things and not really paying attention to anything that is challenging or negative. And these things are still causing your child to melt down, and you're trying everything you can. I would say at that point, start considering PDA.
It's time to make a call to Dr. Brandi. Dr. Brandi, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
I'm so glad that we could feature Dr. Brandi Smith about PDA and the PDA profile because I didn't really know what it was. And to meet one parent means there's other parents out there that have children that meet that PDA profile. So again, make sure you're getting in contact with Dr. Brandi over at the ChildrenAutismAwarenessCenter.com website. She's listed on there, and you can make an appointment if you especially feel like something like PDA is going on with your child. Thank you so much for checking out Life with the Spectrum. Again, each and every week trying to bring you the latest in cutting-edge therapies, resources and tools, organizations and foundations, and people making a difference and being a force for good. If you know of someone that I need to be speaking with, make sure to like, comment, share, comment below, DM me, and most of all, subscribe to the show. Now in podcast form, you can grab Life with the Spectrum and all the latest episodes as well on all of the major players, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, you name it, all right? So until next week, we live life with the Spectrum. See ya.
Bye.